Imagine you're living 100,000 years ago. There are no farms, no villages, no bread, no beer, no wine. Every day begins with the same question. Can you find enough food before something finds you? Your tribe has been walking for hours beneath the scorching sun. Berries, roots, anything edible. Finally, someone spots fruit scattered beneath a tree. It's softer than usual. Sweeter, almost too sweet. No one knows it. But those forgotten fruits have been lying on the ground for days. Tiny organisms, invisible to the human eye, have been quietly transforming their sugars into something entirely new. You take a bite, the taste is strange, yet surprisingly pleasant. A few moments later, your body begins to feel different. Your thoughts become lighter, your fears seem quieter. The people around you can't stop laughing. Without realizing it, you may have just become one of the first humans in history to get drunk. But could that really have happened? Was alcohol one of humanity's greatest discoveries? Or was it simply one of our oldest accidents? To answer that question, we have to travel back to a world long before breweries, vineyards, or civilization itself. It's easy to imagine alcohol as a human invention. After all, people brew beer, people make wine, people distill whiskey. Surely someone had to invent it. But here's the twist. Humans didn't invent alcohol. Nature did. Long before the first human was born, long before the first stone tool, long before our ancestors even walked upright, tiny yeast floating through the air had already mastered an extraordinary trick. Whenever ripe fruit fell from a tree and began to rot, those microscopic organisms fed on the fruit's natural sugars. As they did, they produced a new chemical, ethanol, the same type of alcohol found in beer, wine, and countless other drinks today. In other words, the world's first brewery wasn't built by humans. It was built by nature. Every tropical forest, every fruit tree, every warm season, quietly producing small amounts of alcohol for millions of years. Which raises an even bigger mystery. If alcohol existed long before humans, when did humans first discover it? And perhaps more importantly, why did we keep coming back for more? To answer that, scientists didn't begin with ancient humans. They began with animals. Because strange things happen when fruit is left alone. The sweet smell of fermenting fruit spreads through the forest, and animals notice. Birds have been seen stumbling after eating overripe berries. Some primates deliberately seek out fermenting fruit. Even elephants have inspired stories about becoming intoxicated after eating fermented fruit, although many of those stories are exaggerated. The important point isn't that animals throw parties. It's that many species are naturally attracted to the smell of fermentation. And ancient humans were no different. For hungry hunter-gatherers, the scent of ripe, fermenting fruit could signal something incredibly valuable. Calories. Fruit rich in sugar contains more energy than many wild foods. Finding it could mean the difference between eating well or going hungry. Some researchers even propose that our ancestors evolved to recognize tiny amounts of ethanol because it helped them locate ripe fruit hidden deep within forests. In other words, our relationship with alcohol may have begun not in celebration, but in survival. And yet, a few mouthfuls of naturally fermented fruit weren't enough to create civilizations. For that, humanity needed one more accident, one that would change history forever. For tens of thousands of years, getting drunk was probably rare. A lucky accident, a handful of overripe fruit, a warm day, a little too much fermentation. Then, everything changed. Around 12,000 years ago, humans began settling down. Instead of wandering endlessly in search of food, they started growing it. Wild grasses became fields, fields became harvests. And for the first time in history, people had something they had never possessed before: surplus, more grain than they could eat in a single day. So they stored it inside baskets, clay pots, animal skins, simple containers that were often warm, damp, and imperfect. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Then one day, someone opened a forgotten container. The grain had mixed with rainwater. Wild yeast drifting through the air had quietly gone to work. The liquid smelled strange. Sweet, sour, unlike anything they'd tasted before. Most people would have poured it onto the ground. But human curiosity has always been one of our greatest survival tools. Someone tasted it, then another and another. The result wasn't poison. It wasn't ordinary food either. It changed the way they felt. People laughed more. Fear softened. Conversation became easier for the first time. Humans realized they could create this feeling again, not by waiting for fruit to ferment naturally, but by making it happen themselves. It wasn't a discovery born in a laboratory. It was a forgotten pot, a little rain, invisible yeast, and an incredibly curious human. But something even stranger happened next. Alcohol stopped being just a drink. It became something much bigger. It became part of what it meant to be human across the ancient world. People began gathering not just to eat, but to drink together. The drink in their hands wasn't always the same. Sometimes it was a primitive beer, sometimes fermented fruit, sometimes honey transformed into mead. But the ritual was remarkably similar. People laughed, sang, told stories, remembered ancestors, celebrated births, mourned the dead, made promises, and formed friendships. The drink mattered, but perhaps what mattered even more was sharing it, because for the first time in history, alcohol wasn't changing one person's mind. It was bringing entire communities together. And that's when a simple biological accident became something far more powerful. It became culture. At this point, the story seems simple. Humans discovered alcohol. They enjoyed it. And they kept making more. Case closed. But archaeology tells a far stranger story. For generations, historians believed that farming came first, and alcohol came later. The logic seemed obvious. First, humans learned to grow grain. Then they used some of that grain to make beer. Simple. Except, some archaeologists have suggested the opposite may also have played a role. What if beer wasn't just a product of agriculture? What if it was one of the reasons agriculture spread in the first place? Imagine you're part of one of the first farming communities. Growing grain is exhausting. It takes months of work. The harvest can fail. Wild food is still everywhere. So why stay in one place? Why spend an entire season protecting fields? Food is one answer. But perhaps celebration was another. A successful harvest wasn't just about surviving another year. It was a rare chance for the entire community to gather, to feast, to tell stories, to strengthen friendships. And if someone had discovered that grain could become something even more special, something that made people laugh, sing, dance, and feel connected, then those celebrations became unforgettable. No one can prove that beer created agriculture. Most researchers think food production was the primary driver. But the idea that alcohol helped reinforce early farming communities remains one of archaeology's most fascinating debates. Whether it started civilization or simply grew alongside it, one thing is certain: alcohol quickly became woven into nearly every part of human life. The ancient Sumerians wrote hymns celebrating beer. Egyptian workers were sometimes given beer as part of their wages. Wine found its way into religious ceremonies, across continents and across thousands of years. Different civilizations discovered different recipes, different flavors, different traditions. Yet they all arrived at the same remarkable conclusion. This strange liquid wasn't just something you drank. It was something you shared. Perhaps that's why alcohol has survived for thousands of years. Not because humans wanted to escape reality, but because they wanted to experience it together. And maybe that's the biggest surprise of all. The story of alcohol isn't really about getting drunk. It's about trust, community, celebration, curiosity, and one tiny organism, yeast, that quietly changed the course of human history. The first human who tasted fermented fruit had no idea what was happening inside that sweet, overripe bite. They didn't know about chemistry. They didn't know about microbes. They didn't know they were taking part in a process that had existed for millions of years. They were simply hungry. Yet that single moment, repeated by countless forgotten people across countless forgotten generations, eventually gave rise to breweries, festivals, religions, empires, and traditions that still exist today. Sometimes history begins with a king. Sometimes it begins with a war. And sometimes it begins with a piece of fruit left on the ground for just a little too long.